with that, we are going to begin our today's discussion. Today, we have Rachid Nugmanov, who's a film director from Kazakhstan. The reason we're having this discussion now is that there is a recent documentary production that was made by Rachid and his crew about Mongolian and world history, and of course, history of Kazakhstan too. The documentary is titled Batu, Historical Detective, and we also have a panel of experts Rachid interviewed in his documentary. Not all of them, of course. There are over 20 people, but we have some of the best of the scholars who were interviewed. Of course, Dr. Timothy May, Diane Wolff, and Stephen. Are you with us? Good.
Okay, good.
Okay, shall we move on to the discussion? Rachid, this is a very big production. And as you just mentioned to us, hours upon hours of interviews about this specific subject you chose. So what inspired you to make this production?
Well, if you go to the sources, of my interest, it was in early childhood, actually, because as many younger people from my generation, we were excited by the trilogy written by Vasily Yan. It's a Soviet writer. And he wrote 3 books: Chinggis Khan, Batu, or how it was called in Russian, Batu, and To the Last Sea. And so we were fascinated by the times of Mongolian conquest, and all of those wonderful characters. And we couldn't read much about them in the books. I'm not even mentioning Soviet history, because this period was kind of erased from the history in schools. And then, of course, it developed over time when I was a student and then practicing architect, and worked for the History and Culture Society of Kazakhstan, Preservation Society of Kazakhstan. So, and I crossed my country many times from east to west, south to north. So on touching all those artifacts, from the era, my interest became even deeper. Of course, I didn't think at the time that I would be a filmmaker. I would make a film about it. But when I entered Moscow Film School and started to think about it, of course, I understood that that would be a very expensive project. All history projects are really not easy, to get green-lighted. But sometime in 2014, when Russia, invaded Crimea and the east of Ukraine, my interest, became enormous. And I started to research all the available sources and books written by, first of all, of course, by scholars, but not by fiction, and started to write my screenplay. And it's live action screenplay. I would, at the beginning, I thought of it as a feature film. And then I understood it's not possible just to put all the story, all the characters in one film. Even if we have 2.5 hours, it's not enough. So I switched to a project of mini-series. And my next step was, even though I read a lot of books and stuff, I don't know enough about all the characters, of course. That's why this idea was born. So speak with top scholars from around the world about those characters, about what motivated them to do what they did, and to know the facts deeper than I could find myself. And as soon as I decided to contact the academic circles, I decided that probably we should record all the interviews with them and make a film out of it, a documentary. So, and then I applied for a grant from the Ministry of Culture of Kazakhstan and won it and made the film. That's how it happened. So this film is just like a first step to the live action miniseries, fictional miniseries. And I would like to attract the attention of a younger generation to the 13th century, to those people, what happened actually in those times. That's my plan. Because we have to make entertainment to get the younger generation interested in this.
Sort of grab the attention of the coming.
Right. But this documentary is, of course, it was not made for entertainment. It's more for the people who more or less familiar with this era, with Mongolian history. It's maybe it's not that easy to understand for first-time viewers. Let's see.
Well, then we'll have to see the future episodes of the miniseries too. So, what about our the film you interviewed before we began the live stream? You said that there were about 20. Was it 26 experts that?
26. Right.
How did you come to interview these people? So you contacted the academic circles, and then perhaps especially when an academic field is sometimes very narrow, very esoteric, and when they study one subject, everyone kind of gets to know each other. So
yes,
perhaps how did you manage to interview some 20-odd people?
Well, of course, I got in contact first with top scholars in Kazakhstan. We have some wonderful people, historians in Kazakhstan, and they know each other well, and the historians in Russia and around the world, and they would recommend me, so I would go from one to another, and so this team was, assembled. Now, I also knew some historians before from Russia. For example, I knew for a few years this historian from St. Petersburg, Roman Podchikaev, who wrote several books, and one of them about Batu. And I maintained, relationship with and communication with him. So, and he suggested me all other Russian scholars, top Russian scholars there. And of course, they all suggested me their colleagues from Europe and the United States and Canada, as Stephen Powell. And like this, it's going from one to another. And I also contacted Jack Weatherford, whose book is very popular in Kazakhstan, the Chinggis Khan in the making of the modern world. But when he saw the list of speakers, yes, it is popular. When he saw the list of speakers, he said, "Well, I better stay away from because I'm not on the same level with them." He was quite, modest. But he was, always there. He suggested me to contact Diane Wolff, who is present at this conference. And and I kept him, informed of all of the developments, and he saw the final version of the film also, and he has said many good words about it, about our work. At the time, he was stuck somewhere in Asia, in South Asia. He couldn't get to Mongolia, where he was going, because of the lockdown. So there was a difficult time, for our documentary, because we couldn't travel because of those lockdowns. And so we most of the interviews, with the exception of Kazakhstan and Russia and Ukraine, were made remotely. So I would hire local crews in all those countries, in Mongolia, in France, in the US, and they would shoot them on the spot, on the set, and I would be connecting with the speakers by Zoom, by internet, asking them questions like this.
I see. So
otherwise, we
how
would
we are
never
doing
make
now.
it. Yeah, would never make it. No.
Oh, that's a terrific story. At ACMS, we are supporting a lot of scholars to do their field research in Mongolia, and certainly the COVID pandemic has affected their work too.
Yeah,
I see that even in production of films and documentaries, COVID has been a very
right.
a massive factor, and making it impossible to
Absolutely,
travel around.
because we were planning to spend a lot of time in Mongolia shooting there, but unfortunately we couldn't. Mongolia was completely closed down for us to travel, and we actually managed to record one interview, but it was great. It was great.
I see. So let's get into the subject of the film. You named the film Historical Detective. So why name it a detective? Sort of, it is a modern role, and I'm sure there were people who would be looking for investigating crimes even back then. But is it a sort of a modern lens for the past?
Right. It comes from the idea for the fictional story, for miniseries. When you are trying to do something for a broad public, for the wider audience, you have to concentrate on, on the story, and the story must have the core of the story that would be able to attract people and easy to understand. So you have to choose between the different genre, which would be close to the modern culture, easy, understandable. And so I decided to concentrate on the death of Chinggis Khan's elder son, Jochi, because until this day there no single version how it happened. Was it a hunting accident, or illness, or maybe a plot, assassination? And so I decided to build this fictional story around Batu, then a young, man of 18 or 20 years old, who became the ruler of his ulus, his territory, and trying to understand what happened to his father. Because without understanding what has happened actually to him, he wouldn't be, his future would be uncertain as a strong politician. He would always be, on second roles. So he started to investigate it in my imagination, my fantasy. And he decided that his father was actually assassinated, and dedicated the rest of his life to avenge, to bring justice to the culprits, as he thought. But to do it, he had to build a big empire, because he had to have power to do that. And so he built this golden horde. Of course, in the real life, the motivations were much richer, deeper, and would include a lot of stuff hardly understandable for the modern audience. So I have to make it simpler like this. So, but this simplicity is only on the surface, you know, the real deep things there under the surface. And then this is quite naturally, I made this documentary also as a detective. So as if we are speaking with the witnesses of the murder case that happened 8 centuries ago. And the only witnesses we can find these days are scholars, you know, people who investigate themselves all the events of the 13th century. That's how this idea was born.
I see. So the detective is kind of a framing device to tell the history behind the.
That's right. Yeah.
The title. I see.
Yeah. To concentrate on something, on one subject, and then to speak about everything that surrounded that subject.
I see. So I would like to move on to discuss the. I suppose you can call it the plot. So our panelists can also jump in. I would like to also hear their voices on this matter. So one of the main devices that's moving the story is the death of Jochi. This is what really motivates Batu to really conduct these investigations after he comes into power. So what do we really know about the death of Jochi? I like to think of myself as a student of history, and I've read some versions from official textbooks, history textbooks, or sometimes I would read from blogs about what really happened to Jochi and how he died. So is the verdict really out on Jochi's death? Was he really killed, or did he die of natural causes?
If you ask me, there's no one verdict, you know. The people think differently. You should also understand that when there's an investigation, we delve into all the possible versions of his death, right? So we must consider all points of view, and to make a verdict, you know, you need actually to launch a trial and have a judge and jury. Yes, and that would be actually a good continuation of this documentary if we could assemble all those interviews that we shot and present them as if during the trial. So the investigator passed this case over to the judge, and there are debates about it, and the jury must, you know, make the final verdict, and that would be the audience.
I see.
So as we know, the Mongolians, they knew how to keep their secrets, and it's very difficult to get the truth.
Since this is a historical matter, I would like to ask the experts, what do the sources say about Jochi's death? Dr. May, do you have any insight into this?
Well, that's the great thing about the sources, is that they don't agree on most issues. You do have one source, I believe it's Juzjani, who is a Persian historian who fled the Khwarezmian Empire into the Sultan of Delhi, and basically everything he writes about the Mongols tends to be very hostile and always portrays them in you know, the worst light he possibly can, although sometimes he favors certain figures in the Mongol empires over others. And you can tell his hostility because whenever someone dies, basically he doesn't say that they died. He writes that and they went to hell. So like with he does mention that Jochi was poisoned. Off the top of my head, I cannot remember if he said that Chinggis Khan had him poisoned or if someone else did. There were some, I remember reading rumors that maybe Chinggis Khan did because he and Jochi were having a feud. But from my own research, the origin of that feud is basically that Jochi is going to break away and set up his own empire or kingdom, become a rival. But from my own research, the last interactions they have, that it certainly doesn't seem like that. He's definitely hunting a lot, but a lot of his hunting is tied to a couple activities. One, he's rounding up game for the Mongolian army for their march back to Mongolia to deal with the Tangut revolt. So basically he's doing these big hunts to procure game to then feed that army. The other thing that these hunts do, and they're out in the Dachi Kipchak, basically what would now be the steppes of Kazakhstan, southern Siberia, is that they're a show of force for all of the local Kipchak and Kangli tribes, any other powers that are out there, is that, you know, he's going around and showing his army, and in some ways sort of daring them to start a fight, so he can make sure that they're subdued. You know, we have to remember that this is an era where they don't have, you know, TV, the internet, the radio, or anything like that. So one way of showing that who's in control is by marching around with your army and, you know, basically showing the flag as it was. So I really don't know if he was assassinated or if he died from hunting. I think in there, I mentioned that he's not really in a position where he would have been necessarily at risk in hunting, but at the same time, if we look at the history of Chinggis Khan, he gets thrown from his horse twice while hunting, once with a boar, once while he's hunting the hulan, the wild asses of the steppe. They startle his horse, and you know, even the most experienced horsemen can get thrown from their horse, and that's always going to be a risky thing. And what I really liked about how Rachid did this film was, you know, you have 26 different people, and you can often come away with almost 26 different views on it. You know, it's like watching an accident. Everyone sees something slightly different. We might all agree that yes, he died, but exactly the circumstances and who did it is different. And it shows that history is not static, and that's why we have jobs as historians, is that we are always trying to figure out what really happened. So that's another reason why I like the title historical detective, is because that's what historians do, is that, and I don't think I ever really thought about it quite that way before this, that we are trying to solve certain mysteries. And I'm going to stop talking so Diane and Stephen can also voice in here.
Okay, Diane, are you with us, or has the hurricane
I'm
taken
here. Can you
Okay.
hear me?
Yes, we can
Yeah.
hear you.
I was having a
So-
little trouble. I told you the reception might get weird because of the hurricane.
Yeah. What's your take on this? How did Jochi die, in your opinion?
Well, first I would like to say I was very honored when Rachid contacted me, because all of these scholars that he is interviewing are the elite of the elite, and they are doing groundbreaking work in changing our view of this century. And I'm the literary person. I'm taking their scholarship and creating it for a wider audience, more like a storyteller. So I'm taking images, action, atmosphere from their work and creating it in what I consider to be a poetic way, hopefully for young readers, hopefully for a general audience. But I am privileged to be working from their sources. And my focus, when I wrote Batu, Khan of the Golden Horde, the Mongol Khans conquer Russia, it was because he was lost to the West. This story was completely lost to the West. And what I saw him was something that he inherited from Chinggis Khan, which is his brilliance at strategy. He saw the empire going into the hands of weak men, going down the tubes from spending into bankruptcy. And I think he wanted to change the course of the empire. And he's the man who invaded Europe. So that's why if he had not changed the course of the empire, putting Mongol Khan on the throne and taking the house of Ogadei off, I saw him as a kingmaker. I saw him as the man, he would have invaded Europe, and to most of the predictions that I've ever seen among these great scholars, think that he would have prevailed because the European armies were no match for the high discipline of the Mongol army. And Timothy May is the great scholar on Mongol warfare. But they were disunified. So I was trying to show a contrast between the discipline and the loyalty of the Mongolian culture. And then it's fabulous. It's almost comic. The Holy Roman Emperor is kicking the Pope out of Rome. The Roman Pope is kicking the Holy Roman Empire out of the church, right? And all of the European rulers, when Batu appears in Russia, they're saying, oh my God, he's coming. And they're writing back, please send us reinforcements, send us troops. And Frederick is saying, look, just fortify your castles, you'll be fine. I'm not sending an army there, it's no problem. So this is what I saw. I was focusing on the European, and my own, I think Rachid's structure for this film is brilliant. And it's a fantastic way of presenting history. First of all of us who are reading the scholars don't have access to many of the Russian translations and he's providing that. So that's a new source, and it's a great contribution to the field. So I was really honored to be included because I'm, as Jack Weatherford said, I'm not on the level of these people. I'm a storyteller. So, but I try to be faithful and balance all of these sources and tell a story that's authentic and true for a new audience. And I believe with Rachid that it should be presented to a new generation. And I'm trying to write in such a way that this is accessible. Timothy said something really interesting to me. He said, I was looking for things to assign to my classes that would engage my students with history that were not necessarily textbooks. So that's why he was interested in another book that I wrote about Kublai Khan. So that's the audience that, I like writing for a student audience and teaching as well. So that's it.
All right. So kind of use your imagination to
exactly
fill up certain little
Jochi
details.
I think Jochi either died. I think Jochi died during a hunt, or comparing all the sources. It was my idea that because he had been in Russia and where all the trade was going, and that trade was on the Volga, that he might have been an early victim of the Black Death because the plague came, but not till later. So I had thought it's possible that he contracted a battlefield disease and died. These are among the possibilities suggested by many of the historians, but in
later history of Mongolia, a lot of Khans and a lot of important people have died from smallpox or like some kind of pox-like disease.
Right.
This is like pre-Qing dynasty Mongolia. So that is an interesting perspective.
Well, the battlefield diseases, Genghis Khan never left an enemy population behind the advancing front line of the army. That's why he killed it. He wasn't killing for the pleasure of killing. It was a practical military decision. And when Yelu Chutsai joined him as the prime minister, he basically said, you've got to stop killing all these people because that's where the battlefield epidemics are coming from. It was typhus and cholera, which were killing people, So that was an issue and Genghis Khan gradually, as Yelu said, it's more profitable to tax the population than to kill it off. So.
I see. Stephen, I would like to have your take on this. You are your subject of interest is the Golden Horde and like the Russian part of the Mongol Empire, right? So what do you think? What was how did Jochi die? Was he killed? Was he poisoned? Did he die from natural causes, or did he die from a disease?
Well, the story told by Otepmesh Haji is later. It's written down in the 1500s, but it is actually from the Golden Horde. It's the stories that were carried around in the Jochid realm itself. And their story is very fitting about his death, which is that he was chasing a Kulan and he fell off his horse. The Kulan maybe attacked and he broke his neck and died. So it's a death that perhaps you could say Jochi would have wanted to have if he had to pick one, because it was literally that cliche that he died doing what he loved. But I do sometimes wonder, is this more the how it should have been? And maybe his end was not so ideal. Maybe he could have died young from disease. There were a lot of diseases moving around. And of course, there's the less likely, but still even more tragic possibility of poisoning. I don't know about this. This is why this is such a perfect historical detective movie, and why that title is so apt, and the way this movie was structured by Rachid, because you're essentially, it's a bit like Rashomon. There's these different witnesses, and they all have a different take on what happened. Yeah. And with this one, I sometimes I do think the fun of the Mongol Empire is trying to solve the mystery, but with this one, I really, when you have a bunch of good options, a bunch of plausible options, but what we can say is Jochi died young. He died before his time. He died even before Chinggis Khan, and that itself, it has a big effects on what happened next in the empire and in the Jochid moves.
Yeah, it is a real Scooby-Doo mystery, if you will. So when I was watching the demo, one line really kind of caught my attention because I wasn't expecting it, I think. Rachid, you draw a comparison between the rivalry of Jochi and Chagatai with the biblical brothers Cain and Abel. So where did that inspiration come from? How do you see the parallel? Is this a parallel, or is it not a parallel? If it's a parallel, then is it a valid parallel? What do you think?
Well, when you're investigating a death, and there is a version about assassination, you must explore it, because you can't just kill for nothing. There must be some reason to it. So that's how you're starting to explore it. When you're exploring the version of assassination, there are a couple of versions. It was ordered by Chinggis Khan himself or by his brothers. And when we investigating this murder case, we must speak about, and we must investigate the relationships between the Jochi and his other brothers, and especially Chagatai, because we find in many sources that there was a kind of feud between them too, and it seems like it goes from their early childhood. And Chagatai accusing Jochi as being, a bastard son, not the son of Chinggis Khan himself. So that's how we, if we speak about this assassination, we must consider the relationship between Jochi and Chagatai, and of course Ogedei as well, because Chagatai supported Ogedei and took part in his election of the next great Khan. So that's how it came about. And I must add that I'm as a filmmaker who must, involve the audience to the maximum extent possible. Of course, the version of assassination wins the other ones, even if it's not true. That's why I, in my fictionalized story, I imagine that Batu becomes, convinced that he was assassinated, and even Batu could be wrong, but that's what he decided. That's when he came to the Ulus and tried to restore how this hunting happened, how the all those groups of warriors moved, hunters, but they were warriors, because hunting actually is on that big scale. The hunting, it was more like military maneuvers, like exercise. And when he started to explore this and speaking with participants, and I imagined he couldn't find witnesses. They all disappeared. And so no one could tell him how it happened exactly. Was it just, was just wild kulans, wild animals who killed him? And he found it unlikely, because his father was born, on a horse, like his entire life, he knew how to hunt. And as Timothy said, he wouldn't be in danger during the hunting that he himself organized. So it could be staged and then hidden. And then those killers would disappear who were surrounding him. Because there are many, many different, groups of hunters, or maybe on 100 kilometers between them. So it was like a real military exercise. So, and it could be planned there. That's my version. Not really my version, because I'm not a historian. It's like a version of Batu, who is portrayed in the series.
I see.
Yeah.
So I asked this question with an intent too, because like for my scholars, I've prepared this question. So this is kind of a foreplay to bring in the discussion about the Chinggis infighting. So the
Right.
Some of the latest books in Mongolian that I've read. There's a 5-volume book about the history of the Mongol Empire that recently came out from the National University and also the Mongolian Academy of Sciences. And they seem to talk about a kind of civil war between these Chinggis princes. And they point to the relations between these 4 brothers, especially the real parentage, or the implied real parentage of Jochi, is a focal point in this. It seems to be a focal point in this infighting, a war between these princes that divided the empire. So would you comment about the relations of these brothers? Like, I know in Mongolia, most people are most familiar with the secret history of the Mongols, but there are other sources, other historical history texts that have been written not long after these events. So, Dr. May, would you start?
Yes. The first thing we have to remember with all the sources is that they are not unbiased. All of the sources want to project a certain idea or image. And the secret history is the one source where we get the information that perhaps Jochi was a Merkit bastard. Borte is abducted. She's gone for several months, and when Chinggis Khan finds her, she is pregnant. Jochi's born not long after. Personally, I don't believe he was a Merkit bastard. I think she was pregnant, and that's one of the reasons why she gets captured, is because she can't escape. This is something that I've been looking at fairly recently. But yeah, nonetheless, there's a lot of rivalry between the brothers. And part of that is, I think that, there's no clear line of succession. Primogeniture is not the key. Ultimogeniture, where the youngest inherits the throne. In steppe empires, we see, the idea, of course, is to find the best person to rule among, the sons or even brothers. That doesn't always happen. It's often, whoever's the strongest grabs it, not necessarily the best ruler. But to me, it's not surprising that if you do have two brothers who are not getting along well, one of them's definitely going to, go with any rumor he has to disparage the other one. I mean, heck, we see that in politics all the time. No matter how ridiculous it is, some people will want to believe it just because it fits their idea. So it is very clear in all of the sources that Chagatai and Jochi don't share a lot of brotherly love, shall we say. Again, in all the sources, it's also very clear that Chagatai and Ogadai are very close. And we see this in many ways. For instance, on a lot of campaigns against the Jin Empire, and then of course later the Khwarezmian Empire, Jochi and Chagatai, I'm sorry, not Jochi and Chagatai, Chagatai and Ogadai are always paired up. I think part of that is because Ogadai is not a great military leader. Jochi's very competent. He's led armies. He's been on campaign. He's been tutored by some of Chinggis Khan's best generals like Sube'etei and Jebe. Tolui is a brilliant commander. We see this not only against the Jin Empire, but also in the Khwarezmian campaign, where he's leading armies by himself. Ogadai and Chagatai very rarely have sole command of an army. So my guess is they're slightly intimidated by the abilities of their brother. But we also see some, Chagatai tends to see things very black and white. He will eventually come to know the Yasa of Chinggis Khan inside and out, and view it very cut and dry, very literally. Whereas Ogadai over time begins to see that there needs to be some interpretation depending on the situation. And we get this in Juvayni, and then also Rashiduddin, who basically copies a lot of what Rashiduddin, what Juvayni has to say. We'll see these little stories about Chagatai and Ogadai doing things, and it often seems like, well, Ogadai kind of tricks Chagatai, or kind of doesn't changes what should be the Yasa a little bit. But it's also because Ogadai is, in my opinion, figuring out that the Yasa is great for ruling nomads, but once you start bringing in all these other cultures and sedentary societies and things like that, that also have their own legal systems and have a very different culture, it doesn't work quite as well. And eventually there's going to be conflicts.
I agree.
And so we see sort of Chagatai always having this one particular view, but he always goes along with Ogadai because he accepts that, okay, my brother is the Khan, and so ultimately he's going to be right. He's a very loyal follower of Ogedei. And you know, I think he's, as they say, you know, he drank the Kool-Aid, so to speak, when it comes to Ogedei as being the Khan. He follows him without question. You know, he has his own views, but he will do whatever Ogedei says. But at the same time, it's very clear that there are tensions with the other brothers. I do definitely think that, I don't know whether if Jochi was killed, but or assassinated, but I definitely think Tolui was.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that Tolui was assassinated or possibly accidentally killed in an attempt to get rid of Ogedei, but that's a long story. So I'll let Stephen or Diane pick it up.
Go ahead.
I
Diane?
have a kind of an interesting sidelight on this. It's about the relationship between Bortai and Chinggis Khan. When she was kidnapped, it was because he was a young Khan. He was inexperienced at setting up a camp, and he had only begun his rise in the steppes because she brought to him, she waited for her marriage to him to be accomplished. Her father tried to marry her off to other suitors because Temujin, as Chinggis Khan was called in his youth, he had many setbacks. But she waited, and she brought him a dowry of clans, herds, and the famous cloak of black sable. But she brought him the money that he needed to rise in the steppes. And as a young Khan, he made a promise to her that her sons would inherit his empire. So when he set up his camp, he forgot to set up the sentries in the perimeter, and that's how come they could be surprised and she could be captured. And I believe that he always felt that it was his fault that she was captured, and he himself never brought up the issue of Jochi's paternity. He ignored it because he felt that it was his fault, and I see it as a bond between the two of them. I'm fascinated by this angle of the loyalty between these two people. And it's something that, I mean, all Batu would have had to go to was to speak to his grandmother and say, you know, tell me the story of my father's birth. That's, you know, it's a very simple question. So, but I thought I'd bring in that angle for consideration. I'm fascinated by Dr. May's statement that he felt that Tolui was assassinated because there are stories about, there are mythical stories about the way that he died and everything like that. But as I am very drawn to the relationship, that, again, the female angle, Princess Sorghaghtani, because there was a love match there. That was a real match. And that marriage was arranged by Chinggis Khan, and she was his favorite daughter-in-law. And he married her because he wanted Tolui to support the reign of Ogedei with the army, because Tolui inherited 120,000 troops. He inherited the bulk of the Mongol army. And his job was not to, according to Chinggis Khan, was not to rule, but to support the rule of Ogedei.
Very interesting.
What's
we'll return
fascinating
to,
as well is that
Sorghaghtani in a bit. Please, Stephen, go on.
The conflict that's going to erupt finally in 1259, 1260, there is this big explosion of these family tensions in the around 1260, and with Mancha Khan taking power in 1251. And we know that princes were killed. We know that queens were killed. We know, you know, that even the official records left behind by the Mongol courts don't hide some of these killings and these arrests, interrogations. And we know that all of this conflict was already, the groundwork for it was already laid with Chinggis Khan's 4 sons and the tensions between them. And I think that's what's such a good story that's finally captured in this documentary. that this really is as simple as a family rivalry or some kind of thing like this that's going to get more complex. And whereas in the time
trying
of
to avoid
Jochi,
saying family
in this
feud.
first generation,
Well, yeah.
yes, I am at all costs. But the thing that is certain is that they were killing each other off in the 1250s. But when you get to this first generation, things can be, there's less source material. There's more secrets. Secrets are better kept. And I think that's interesting. And that's where this deep mystery lies about what really happened to Jochi that set this intense tension for the grandsons of Chinggis Khan.
Yeah. That's right.
Right. Let's.
If I may say a couple of words about it, also.
Of course, please.
Yes, the secrets were kept very well, and the secret history of Mongols is a great work of fiction. Pre-Shakespearean great writer wrote it. What really happened, we don't really know. We cannot judge by on this source. I personally see this story as a kind of a sort of a godfather of the 13th century, when Batu, it's like Michael Corleone, was raised to be a ruler, not a warrior, has to become a warrior, has to become a killer, and restore family values. That's and by doing so, he becomes, of course, on one side, very contradictionally, was called the good king, Sign Han, and on the other side, as Stephen called him in the film, it's absolutely justified, a devil during the times of war. But we must also not forget that Batu actually spent like 5 or 6 years at war, and the rest of his rule was building his ulus, building cities, actually, not only one capital, but many others, and continuing what I would call the business plan of Chinggis Khan, is controlling trade between China and Europe and Egypt, and providing for only one tax along the whole Silk Road, and protecting the Silk Road. And because before, it would pass a lot of different territories, and each territory is another problem, danger and taxes and so on. So while silk would arrive to Venice, it would cost 10 times more or whatever, and it was available only for very rich people. So it's actually Batu, I consider Batu as one of the best, if not the best, manager of this business plan of Chinggis Khan, who actually managed to build this Silk Road along his ulus. So, but while doing so, he had to, to kill, together with Monkey, they had to kill, I don't know, 70 more members of their families, mostly from Chagatai and Nugaday clans. So he's not an angel.
Yeah. I would like to return to Diane's point about women in the empire. Compared to some other ancient empires, say, for example, the Roman Empire, or before that, the Athenians, they were, and perhaps it is because of these more ancient states or polities, the Western, the West in general picked up the more patriarchal institutions, perhaps like in Rome, for example, the father of the family, the patriarch of the family, would basically own everything in the family, even the people, even the sons and women, wives and daughters' lives. But here it seems like the role of women are very different. So Diane, would you share us some insights about what you've learned and what you wrote about the role of women in Mongol society?
Yes, I think this is one of the most fascinating things. I think that the history of the Mongol Empire is unique in world history because the empire was so vast, it existed in so many different languages, and it had, as Marie Favreau, who is not with us tonight, has pointed out, the horde was on the move. It was characterized by mobility. Because of from my reading, and I'm very interested to hear what our other scholars and filmmakers say, part of the reason that women enjoyed such a unique status in the Mongol world, part of it was the actual, and I've done the readings, the basic readings in shamanism, but I'm not an expert on shamanism, was the nature of the shamanistic religion was the balance of male and female. Male power was the sky, or female power was the earth. There had to be a balance. But if you stop and think about it for a second, the men would be away at war for years at a time. Somebody had to take care of the homeland. So I guess if you had 4 principal wives, you would probably want to pick one who was a decent manager, because when, for example, when Chinggis Khan went away on the Khwarezmian campaign, Borda was at home. She was managing the herds. She was supervising the manufacture of the products of pastoral society, such as the tanning of hides, the creation of felt, the creation of kumis. She was trading with the merchants. She was hearing court cases. She was, in effect, functioning as the governor, and she was expected to inform Genghis Khan on the Pony Express, I call it, but she kept him aware of what was going on. And so the women were managers. And yes, the one thing that Genghis Khan failed to do was provide for an orderly succession to the throne. That was his greatest mistake. And the network for the Kuriltai, for the votes in the Kuriltai, one of the female scholars has written about this. The women were of the Marian clan of the Mongols. So there was a network of female power because they were related to all the families who would vote at the Kuriltai. So what the women could bring to any aspiring Khan or candidate was the votes at the Kuriltai, which was the great genius of Queen Sorghaghtani. That's what she brought to Batu. And so one of the things we have to look at in his rise as the kingmaker, really, of Mongol, which was the direction that the empire would go in, was his alliance with the princess, because he thought she had raised her sons as able men. They were the first of the Mongol princes who were literate. They were Christians of the Nestorian rite, considered to be more civilized. But if you recall, the first thing that Mongol did was send Kublai into southern China, begin the campaign against the Song, and send Hulagu into Iran. Those were Persia and China, the 2 richest and most advanced civilizations, where the revenues would be. And China was always the main object of Mongol arms just because it was the richest and the closest. What Guyug was trying to do was fight go toward Christendom, become the ruler of Christendom, and also not the Islam of Persia, but the Islam of the Middle East. And Monka said, that strategy is out. We're going the other way. So Batu's alliance with Sorghaghtani was actually a vision of the future of the empire, and very much in agreement with what Rachid is talking about. Absolutely correct. The business of the empire after the years of conquest was trade. It was the first sustained, it was the opening of the roads for the first time in 1,000 years, sustained contact between China and Europe, and the fortunes that were made in the overland trade with China, financed the Renaissance in Europe, which was the rebirth of science in the West, and it was the beginning of the rise of the West because Europe was very poor. The markets had collapsed. And this was the chance to break the monopoly of trade, break the monopoly of power, and let the income and the revenues that move into Europe. So critical alliance with a woman. We must give Batu credit for, I think, as a strategist and as an economist, really. So that's my, and I'm very taken with the story of Princess. In my Silk Road series, I have, because Dr. May is saying that this first generation, we don't have a lot of information about them. I tried to assemble as much information as I could and give us a literary, a fictive portrait of some of the most important characters in the first generation, and each one is from a different point of view. But I do have one on Princess Sorghaghtani because we don't know that much about her, and her role has been lost to history. So she was called by Plano Carpini, the papal envoy, the most remarkable woman of her age or any age. So her story has been lost to history, and I tried to revive her story.
Do we have any writings of Western travelers about her, besides Plano Carpini?
I'm trying to think. I can't remember if Rubric talks about her. Bar Hebraeus, who's not a Westerner, he says that if there were any more like her, the race of women would be superior to the race of men. But I have the feeling I describe her because she's a unique archetype that we don't, the Mongol women had higher status than the women of China and the women of Europe. They could own property. People don't think about that, but you know, when a woman married in 19th century England, her property became the property of her husband. He could do with it as he wished. They could ride horses. A Chinese princess could not be conceived of riding a horse. You know, they owned, they managed, you know, it's a unique history. And I think, as I said, it's partly because of the religion and partly because of the necessity of the way the mobility of the society was organized. It was very, very flexible. And the other thing I think, I write about this, and I've written a little fictive thing about the Princess of Korea, the Kublai Khan's second daughter, who became the Queen of Korea. She was told at the age of 16 that she had to go, she married the King of Korea. She was to go and depose the king's first wife, who was the queen. She was to become the queen. And she was to install a Mongol government to replace the government of Korea, because Korea had been at war with the empire for decades. It's the least known of the campaigns. She was 16 years old, and Kublai Khan said, if there's a disagreement, because he was trying to bring peace to Korea because of the trade, again, Rashid's point, the southeastern trade on the maritime Silk Road. She was told that if there was a disagreement between what Kublai Khan wanted and her husband wanted, that her decrees were to surpass those of her husband, the king, which is an extraordinary thing. So I wrote a little serialized story about that, just trying to bring these archetypes of female power, which are completely different from anything we have in the West. You know, we have Chinggis Khan's mother, who was a storyteller, and she created this royal identity for him when he rose. You don't have to be embarrassed by your beginnings because you're an aristocrat. These are your beginnings. And then the other archetypes, which are about balance with male power, not about dominance of either. And I think it's a unique history in the world. So I wrote the 4 archetypes of female power in that little, I call it fish shoes, because when the King of Korea came to Kublai Khan's court, Kublai was indulging in tremendous amounts of alcohol and food, and he had a terrible case of gout. And the King of Korea brought him the fish shoes, the fish skin shoes that eased the pain of gout. That was a product of Korea. So that I was trying to write these interesting little sidelights to these major characters that show their human side, their family side. So once again, this theme that Rachid is bringing up, which is the Godfather and the, those biblical stories of the rivalry of brothers, I think absolutely right. Absolutely right. And so I, in my way, in smaller character studies, really, of these major characters, I was trying to do the same thing, bring the human side out.
No, I think the enduring, like these stories are kind of, there's a similarity because of these rivalries and these familial ties, because family has been a unit in social organization for such a long time that it has become an archetypal thing.
Yeah.
So let's move to the next parts. So the documentary really is about like discovering this a not well-known part of history of the world, and but at the same time, it is very familiar, from fictional medieval shows like Game of Thrones. Now it's what is it? It's prequel, House of the Dragon. There's a lot of scheming, a lot of politics and backstabbing going around. So, is this a kind of an attraction that the general audience has with these shows? Do you think, is it because of this sort of fascination with the politicking, let's say, that people will be attracted to this documentary miniseries?
Yeah, I would definitely think so. I think you see this a lot in just general medieval studies. Some people have called it the Game of Thrones effect. Now, I think, the Game of Thrones and, all the plot twists, whether you're reading the books, I've never seen the show, so I can't really speak to that. But, just by reading the books, you see so many plots and threads and stuff. And it really shows that, life is complicated. And it doesn't matter that it's a fantasy series, because if we think about our own things, we tend to want to look at history as nice, neat, and categorize. We kind of have a linear process of events, and we really want to think of, major historical figures as rational people working in logical ways. But when you really begin to examine them closely, you realize, they're people. And much like, we have the various reputations of Batu, this is true for everybody. And it really depends on who you're looking at and who you're talking to. Of course, the Russians are going to have a slightly negative impression of Batu because he conquered them. Generally speaking, as the Russians have found out recently, people don't like to be occupied. No. They don't like to be conquered. It's just one of those things in life. I don't think anyone anywhere has, well, there have been a few occasions because they thought the previous rulers were really, really bad. And then you get a new one. And like when the Mongols take over Karakhite, people were excited to see the Mongols because Guchuluk, the Naiman prince, was terrible. But for the most part, everyone's going to have a slightly different opinion. And, well, maybe not slightly, but really big. But at the same time, watching the documentary, it made me think, if all of the accusations of people being poisoned are true, the royal family was killing people off left and right via poison, and it would make a really good TV shows. I've always said that. And the great thing about it is that if you just stick with the sources, you have a great show right there. You don't need to have the Hollywood effect. You don't need to have, like that Marco Polo show that was on Netflix. There were a lot of things that were good about it, but then they got really weird and deviated from history. Now, some of it was they stuck with what Marco Polo said, and Marco Polo was a great liar in many ways. But so some of the things they had were kind of, based off of what Marco Polo said he did. Whether or not he really did, it doesn't matter. But if you stick with that, you got great stories. But once you start trying to make it, I guess, current for certain audiences, or go with the tropes of Hollywood or whatever, I say let's go with Bollywood, and let's have Chinggis Khan break out into a Bollywood dance. That would be kind of different. The whole battle scene with the Mongolian Empire could be a Bollywood dance, just to be different. But this is why Hollywood doesn't get me to consult too often. So,
All right.
I can imagine the shock value of breaking the dances.
on horseback too.
Yes.
Yes, to build a drama, you need three essential things. First, of course, it's the hero. We follow them, or several heroes. If we're talking about like mini series with a lot of characters in them, then the hero must have their goal. But you cannot build a drama if the hero sets their goal and they reach it immediately. There's no drama in it. So between the hero and his goal, there's a lot of complications, a lot of obstacles, and that we are playing with those obstacles. And the heroes have to make decisions, sometimes tough decisions, and we follow them and we root for them or we hate them. And the hero changes on his way to his goal. And his goal also can evolve and become different, better or worse. So that's drama. And we have to build it if you want to, to get the attraction of the people. And the other important thing is what is a difficult thing in historical dramas is that it happened like long ago. Okay, when we watch Game of Thrones, it's a fiction world, fantasy world. It's interesting to us, but the drama of Batu happened in real world and on much bigger scale than what we saw in Game of Thrones. And we need to connect these real events of the 13th century to this day. This is also very important. You cannot just watch something happen in the 13th century or blah, blah. That's okay. People killing each other and that's it. No. We need to find deeper connection with present times. And I personally think that the 13th century is, to me, it's the most important time in modern history. And it's all started. And look at Russia. Russia inherited the Golden Horde and more, because this territory stretches from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean. It's enormous territory. Look at China. The clan of Tolui also made an empire out of a few independent states of China or the 30th century. Established capital in Beijing, the same as Batu's followers established Moscow in Russia, because at the time of Russian conquer, it was just a small town of the Vladimir Principality, and then it became a capital of the empire. And they're still there, and they're still fighting, and Moscow is fighting Kiev. The same as there was a rivalry between Vladimir and Kiev in the 13th century, and all other Russian principalities. I mean that this process hasn't ended. It's going on. It's going on. And Kazakhstan is the what remains from the Golden Horde. It's smaller. It's still huge. Still big, and it goes its own way. It's not the way of Russia. And I think there's some interesting future ahead of us in Kazakhstan as well. So to understand better this, the modern politics, the modern situation in the world, and this danger and menace of the World War III, we should not forget about the 13th century, where many, many things started, how it evolved to this day. That was very interesting. And if we make these characters alive with their motivations, with their good and bad sides, with their dreams and their betrayals and all this stuff and cruelty and dreams mixed in one impossible, potion, I would say, that would attract interest, I think. That would allow us to relate to those people, to relate to those times, because you want to understand these days better.
Yes, definitely.
I really agree with that. I really, really liked what you said there, Rachid. It's very true. And I'd add, even places the Mongol Empire didn't conquer or didn't occupy for very long, like Eastern Europe, it was only actually in that area for a short time. But so much of that was transformed. The whole social and political structure of Hungary and Poland adapted to deal with the Golden Horde and Batu's empire there. So they changed how they built cities. They changed how social laws were structured. Romania, all the states of Romania, this is a product of the Golden Horde. It wouldn't have existed without the Golden Horde. The Bulgarian state was shaped by it. The Serbians and Bosnians took their chance to really assert independence in that time because of what the Nogai and the Golden Horde had created in that region politically. So even the structure of the countries today in Eastern Europe is a product of this event, of Batu's horde. So it's not just an interesting story, something that happened a long time ago. This is really modern politics, and what's happening in that part of the world today is shaped by this. And next year will be the 800th anniversary of the Battle of the Kalka, and they think where this battle was fought was Mariupol. So there's just another example. The past is not done with us. And if we want to understand today's problems, these stories matter more than ever, probably.
Interesting. Do you think it is a fair comparison, or perhaps I read in some Western news media that comparing Putin to perhaps a Mongol Khan, do you think it's a fair comparison?
No.
No.
I would
No.
say you could compare more with an early Russian czar, or even a later czar, but not a Khan, because everything I've read about it is that Putin has made decisions, and those are the decisions. Whereas a Khan, and it doesn't matter whether it was Chinggis Khan or Monkey Khan, that they had to listen to other people. They had to get their input. They had to, basically, they have great power, but there's also limits, because if you don't listen to people, if you don't take their input, and then once you start having failures, you're not going to be on that throne that long, because there's plenty of other Chinggisids roaming around. And I think that, going back to some of the statements before of, if Batu thought that the empire was going in the wrong direction, well, that kind of speaks to it. And we do have those issues where, okay, we have the queen regents, Toragene and Ogelheimish, two women of various abilities, who take the empire in a different direction. And some of the change started in the later years of Ogedei. Ogedei should be credited with really creating the administration of the empire, of the bureaucracy and so forth. It was very rudimentary under Chinggis Khan, but Ogedei really built something up. so that it was a rational government. But then in the later years, I think he gets seduced by the wealth and begins to change things a little bit. So that the empire becomes a little bit more exploitative, and then Tortogene just ramps that up. But she's also doing it because she has a very targeted focus, which is to get Guyuk selected as the next Khan, and using that wealth to buy that support. But going back to your question, unfortunately in the West, the image of the Mongols, at least in the popular world, tends to still be largely negative. And I've written this about on numerous occasions, most recently in my book, Simply Chinggis. You have Genghis Khan and you have Chinggis Khan. Genghis Khan is basically a caricature of, whatever you want. Basically this, barbarian, this negative, there's nothing good there. But then you have a real historical figure. And, again, what we said before, if you look at these people, they all have different attitudes. And not so long ago, many people were looking at Putin as a very shrewd character. And then suddenly he's doing this stuff, and it's completely backfired on him. And I think what he was hoping for is legacy. And I can't really make a comparison with him as a Khan. I mean, you might be able to find one Khan who might be a good comparison, because every empire, every society has had bad rulers and people who make bad decisions. But yeah.
You should also take into account the timing. The time of Chinggis Khan, it was the beginning. It was building the empire from zero, ground zero. Now, Putin, it's the end of this empire. It's the last days, last years of the huge empire which lasted for centuries. It's absolutely different situation, not even speaking about all the rest. So those comparisons, they are not grounded. Absolutely no, it's nothing in common.
Actually, I would compare Putin more with Mohammad Khwarizm-Shah. Hubris and a series of bad decisions. And thinking that he was much more powerful than he really was.
I like that. I like that a lot.
I think, have you seen or heard the podcast by, I don't remember the podcast host, but the name of the podcast was Wrath of Khans. The podcaster is called Dan Carlin. So I'm pretty sure he would call every one of us revisionists because of what we just said.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay, I think we should now open to questions from the audiences. If anyone has a question, they can open their microphone and ask the question, or just you should raise your hand first so I can name you. So until we get a question from the audience, I do have a couple of questions that came during, or at least an implied question. One is, where can we see the documentary? So you, Rachid, you mentioned something about a streaming service. Do you perhaps have the name of the streaming service and maybe when the documentaries will be available?
Well, look, we made the film last fall, and as I mentioned before, we during this year, from January to July, we were working on this film ourselves with my crew, polishing some stuff and things and so on. So now we are now finishing the Kazakh version of it. It's almost done. So some little touches and so on, and we would be ready to release it. There's also a question of copyright, because it was 100% funded by the government, but the government cannot work with distribution of movies. So we negotiating some kind of license agreement with them, so we could go ahead and start distributing it on all interested territories and streaming services. But before, I would love to make a premiere. What we made in at the Columbia University a couple of days ago, that wasn't a premiere, it was a closed screening for the academic society. But the real premiere, I would like to make it at the original camp of Jochi in Kazakhstan, in Kazakh. That's territory means Ulitau. That would be appropriate place to start with. So, yeah. Actually, he died sometime in February. Maybe we should shoot for February to get everything ready for this and start from there. So although it's extremely cold in Kazakhstan, especially in Kazgan, those months, but still they are let and they even hunted. So why can't we just sit in the warm cinema theater and watch a movie? No problem. Okay.
All right. I think that answers the question. So let's hope that we can see it sometime in the first quarter of next year.
Surely.
Yeah. Next question is about Christianity, I think. Diane, I think you mentioned Nestorianism, that Princess Sortani was a Christian. So do you know where this branch of Christianity originated or originates from?
From my reading of the sources, the Karyid tribe, which was the tribe of Sorghaghtani's uncle, who was the most powerful man in the steppes during the boyhood of Chinggis Khan, they had converted to Nestorian Christianity a century earlier. And the Nestorians were an ancient community of Christians, I believe headquartered in Baghdad. The head of the church was called the Metropolitan. And the primary belief that characterized the Nestorian, the Eastern Rite of the church, which was considered apostate by the Pope in Rome, they did not believe in the divinity of Christ. They thought that Christ was a prophet, as in the Muslim tradition that Rachid and I were discussing at Columbia. So that the fact that they were Nestorian Christians allowed the Christian communities in the Mongol capital in Karakorum and the Muslim communities got along. And she was a woman, Princess Sorghaghtani was a woman of good works. So she went to the Christian hospitals, she went to the Muslim orphanages, and there was harmony and peace between those two communities. I think, as Rachid has pointed out, because there was no belief in the divinity of Christ.
I see.
So the priests were sent by the Metropolitan of Baghdad. A priest was sent to her to officiate in her church that was in Karakorum. But the church was in Baghdad.
It is very interesting to hear that a group of Christians actually believe that Jesus Christ was not divine.
Well, that's not quite 100% accurate. It's that the difference is they viewed that Jesus was a vessel filled with a divine spirit, but the body was human. So it's a technicality. They view that Mary just gave birth to a child and it was filled with the Spirit of God, thus becoming not, well, it's kind of hard to put into terms,
Okay.
But basically, you think of it, if you think of the body as a temple and the god or the spirit is in that. So basically, that's kind of how it works.
Interesting.
It actually makes the Nestorians closer to the Muslims, who also consider Jesus as one of his prophets of the God.
Yeah,
but not God himself. And in Quran, we can find much more information about Jesus than Muhammad. It's more pages dedicated to him, but he's not the God. It's not from a divine origin.
in the Quran, Jesus is.
That's why they were despised by all the other Christians. Actually, this so-called the Church of the East, the Nestorians, they suffered actually a lot, and from the Christians also from their side.
And if I remember correctly, there was a two traveling monks who went from this part of the world to Europe. Were they Nestorians?
They were. One was his name was Marcos, and he eventually becomes the metropolitan of the Nestorian community in the Middle East. And the other one was Barsama. Barsama was Marcos's teacher, and he will eventually become an envoy for the Ilkhans to go to Europe and try to make up an alliance. And unfortunately, Marcos becomes the metropolitan in a time of upheaval in the Ilkhanate in the Middle East. And basically when Ghazan Khan comes to power and he's converted to Islam, in the early days of that, there were some overzealous people in his vanguard and of the switchover, and there was a lot of persecution of the Nestorian community in that. Marcos actually underwent some torture and things like that, but eventually Ghazan began to realize that things were better when religions were all tolerated. And but that's the thing with a revolution, is that there's always the zealots who get ahead of everything before stability returns.
True. There's another question. There was a mention of limitations to the power of the Khan. So is there such a thing as steppe legislation, like the way we know of like common law system, or like German Roman law system? Was there anything like steppe laws legal system?
Yeah, you had the Yasa, which governed the nomads, and it was not, shall we say, set in stone. Typically, the Khans verified the decrees that came before them, but they also had the freedom to interpret things differently and change things. But still, there were definite limitations on what they could do. Was accepted as normal, and we see this in numerous times in the sources that you needed to abide by the yasa and the yosa, or the custom of Chinggis Khan. Chinggis Khan was seen as basically the primary example of behavior, and so in some ways they're kind of like hadiths in Islam. The billets, the sayings, and the actions of Chinggis Khan. This is proper behavior and things like that. But again, some of these could change over time, which is really what you want to see in a society, because otherwise, if you don't have that flexibility, it will stagnate. But every Khan could interpret things differently, but at the same time, they couldn't go too far, or that's going to trigger a reaction. We see that from time to time, where they viewed that the actions of a Khan, of a ruler, was deviating too far, and inevitably that person would get overthrown.
Okay, I
And
think
there was some rebellions because they viewed him as not really adhering to Mongol tradition.
Right.
so. This second part of the question was: has there ever been an example of a complete set of laws of steppe people found? So it's no.
No, well, not for the Yasa. There have been examples, and some of these, initially, there were several things listed in like Juvayni that were then brought into other Muslim sources in Arabic and Egypt. And these were thought to be the Yasa, but since it's been proven that these are individual decrees, these are sayings and things like that, but they're not actual, laws per se. If there was a Yasa that was written down, and I would imagine there was, it's been lost to us, and maybe one day we'll find it. But unfortunately, we don't have, the great big book of Mongol laws.
There is a very interesting episode told by Simon of St. Quentin, who's often ignored, but he was almost executed. He was a French emissary. Group of French Dominican friars came to Baijiu in Armenia and caused all kinds of controversies, and they refused to bow and whatnot. And so apparently, if you believe his story, the Mongols in Baijiu's tent were having a debate, and they kept mentioning the law. And I thought it was funny because if this story is true, there's a number of figures who are speaking, and they're mentioning you can't break the law. And last time you broke the law and I got in trouble for it, and I'm not getting in trouble for you breaking the law. And it stands against the old ideas of the Mongols as so-called lawless, sed lex in Latin. Like, in fact, they had a lot of laws and they would bring them up and debate about the law. And it stands in such a opposition to kind of the image, the false image, you could say, of the Mongols as these people without law, without civilization. In fact, they're wildly debating about what's legal and bringing up a case against someone if he breaks the law. So it's interesting.
Can I say something here about the law?
Yes.
Kublai Khan, in the early years of his reign, there was a rebellion of Chinese from within his own court. The conspirators had arisen within his own court, and they were in cahoots with the Southern Song. And they had a rebellion, and they were all caught, and the rebellion was put down. And he determined that they were going to be tried by Chinese judges under Chinese law, so that he would not be imposing Mongol law on them, because the Mongols were a conquest dynasty in the north, and they were vastly outnumbered by the Chinese, and he did not want to foment further rebellion. So he excused himself completely and allowed the Chinese judges to hear the case, adjudicate the case, find them guilty, and then perform the executions. But I thought that was fascinating, that he was that flexible.
Interesting. So here's an interesting question. Considering contemporary northern China in ancient time were the land of half-settled proto or para-Mongolic Turkic tribes and polities, is it right to see Mongol society were built in nomadic culture? And why the term China used when there wasn't actually consistent, long-lasting state under this name? So under the name China.
I agree with that. I've often had issues where people refer to the many different ancient kingdoms and empires of China as China. China changes a lot. I mean, in many ways, it'd be like calling the Cherokee Confederation in the eastern United States the United States. The United States doesn't exist. Modern China does not exist until 1911. Before that, you have the Qing Empire, and I have colleagues who often refer to, they're European historians, They're referring to, modern events in the 19th century about dealing with China. Well, you're not dealing with China. You're dealing with an idea of China, but you're dealing with the Qing Empire, which is ruled by Manchus who are not Chinese. The government system, yes, it's heavily influenced by Confucian values and so forth, and that's Chinese. But, there are numerous northern groups that were, Turkic or Manchu and not Chinese. So China, referring to everything as China has become kind of a crutch where people just don't think about it. And it's one of those things that I often wrestle with when I'm writing, like when you're discussing the steps of Mongolia before the Mongol Empire, what do you call it? Mongolia doesn't exist yet. No one's calling it Mongol Uz before the rise of Chinggis Khan. So what do you call it? Well, Mongolia is still conventional. I often write about the Mongols in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan doesn't exist until really the 1800s. But I find it as a convenient geographic term. And I think in that sense, China works the same way, but I definitely have issues kind of using it as a blanket term for everything, because it does give the idea that there's been this continuous history when, no, you've had several kingdoms, several states there. It's not continuous. There's certainly some continuous culture, just like in any other place. But,
So it kind of helps us think about these historical entities in modern geographic terms, but at the same time, it misleads us.
It does.
The term China probably comes from Jin, China, Jin.
Yeah.
And don't forget that the capital of China was established by the Mongols in Beijing, which was on the territory of the Jin Empire. So like Jin, China, I think so. It comes from there.
The Russian term Kitai, that's from Kitan, Kitan Liao. But Jews Jani called China Tamgach. But the first time I read that, the first many times, I go, well, what's Tamgach? I don't know what this is. And this is not going to be a satisfying point for people, but sometimes we just have to try and make sense of things to audiences. And so you have to use words that aren't totally satisfactory and not explanatory, but you have to give a reader, who might know nothing about this part of the world, you have to give them a frame of reference to follow along with the story. And so sometimes we do have to use these. We don't have to, but we choose to use these unsatisfying and inaccurate terms.
Would you say that, since you say that modern China is like the term China comes from 1911, so that's Xinhai Revolution. Would you say that the idea of modern China is a Western construct based on nationalism?
No.
It's complicated. I don't think you can simplify. I think part of it is, China's own use, but as well as a Western construct used, to understand what's going on, because quite honestly, they don't quite get what was going on at the time of the Qing Empire. They just knew that China, I mean, let's face it, when Christopher Columbus set sail, he's trying to find the court of the Khan. He has no idea that the Mongol Empire has fallen, but he knows that the Khan rules China, or this area that in the imagination of the late medieval West is what we'd consider China. He doesn't really understand anything else. And he's also looking for India. And so when he bumps into a continent and finds Native Americans, or what he terms as Indians, it's because he wants to believe he hit India. And he'll go to his grave thinking that, even though other people have proved him wrong. Ultimately, people are going to try to rationalize something with familiar concepts, whether it's a territory, whether it's history, which is also why we have, you know, Putin being compared to a Mongol Khan. It's because that's what they understand it as, but you know, there's obviously flaws in their knowledge, and we're all guilty of it to certain levels.
There's another issue with China in that many of the major scholars of Chinese empire and foreign policy describe yin and yang periods of China, the state, the empire, the civilization of China. When the center is strong, the borders go outward, as in the Qing dynasty, they had an empire. When the center is weak, as in the Ming, the territory retreats. So there is no one concept of China. And for several hundred years, until the coming of Kublai Khan, China was divided into multi-states in the north and then the Sung dynasty in the south. So, and Kublai Khan unified that with his war on southern Sung. So it's yin and yang periods of Chinese history is the best way. There was no one way of defining the Chinese state. China proper, that we call the heartland of China today, was established by Kublai Khan.
All right. So let's take the last question, which was a question for Stephen. So you mentioned that Eastern European countries were kind of adapting and changing the way they do business because of Batu and the Golden Horde. Was there any unified effort by perhaps Eastern European and Central European like polities to counter the Golden Horde and Batu?
There was sort of, although it's always underestimated. I think it's underestimated how much a lot of the things that happened in that region were a reaction to the Mongols. But if you look in the primary sources, it's there, the evidence. Like one thing is the Polish and Hungarians became much closer in the late 1200s, early 1300s. Through the 1300s, there was the Visegrad alliance, I think in the very early 1300s, between the Czechs and Hungarians and Poles. So something was pushing them together. And they do have the sort of unified Polish and Hungarian attacks in the 1280s against the small Mongol invasion. And Poland becomes reunified, but there's also overlapping legal reforms of cities and whatnot. Like lords can build castles for the first time in the 1200s in Hungary. They can build their own castles. So it weakens the king of Hungary, but he's willing to give up this sacrifice. It's got to be something major that would make him do that. It's Batu. And the same thing is happening in Poland. The Polish allow dukes and whatnot, or not dukes, like nobles to build castles. And they start building these cities with stone walls. And this all can weaken the monarchy or the central ruler. That can be the cost. So it's got to be something worth it. They let individuals build high stone towers. They suddenly are appearing all over cities like Krakow and Esztergom. And this weakens the central power of the king, because he can't, now these nobles have much more say and he's got to appease them. So it's got to be something really dramatic that would make them willing to make these sacrifices. And whereas I think historians have mistakenly said, well, this is just the evolution of urban culture, I don't think it's really that. I think this is the Mongols have transformed how people live in that part of the world.
So sort of like the type of governing system that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had. Is that right? Kind of.
A lot like that, yeah.
That's sort of. Okay, I think we have a response to the previous discussion we had. So it reads, I guess the problem is that all these convenient references are used by the modern Chinese state to build up its ideology of nation state that ultimately eliminates all non-Han cultures. So it's a criticism of modern
That's right.
China.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right then. Well then, it's been about 2 hours that we had this big discussion. I'm sure everyone has a lot to do with their with the rest of the day. So let me first thank all the speakers, Rachid, Timothy May, Diane Wolff, and Stephen Powell. And although she couldn't be with us, we also thank Marie Favreau. Thank you all for accepting the invitation to join us today for this meeting, for this discussion. And have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And thank you for the audience for staying with us and listening to our discussion. And I hope that you weren't bored. I think I should also shout out Fish Shoes, a palace drama by Diane Wolff. One of our speakers has recently published a book about Mongolian history that the plot deals with Yuan dynasty and Korean affairs. And of course, Timothy May, who recently published the book The Mongol World, which he explained as a collection of scientific articles as well as an encyclopedia. So it's a massive amount of work. And of course, Rachid, he has produced this amazing mini series of documentaries, which I can't wait to see in February, tentatively. So we will follow Rachid's page and fill you in with updates about the premiere of the documentaries. All right, everyone, goodbye.
Bye.